Do you really want the developer to take a critical issue and hit the ignore button? Maybe your policy changes so that you need two people to agree. Maybe the developer agrees with a security person. And so I think that practice of having controls spread out more broadly becomes important.
You are listening to The Secure Developer, where we speak to leaders and experts about DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and much more. The podcast is part of the DevSecCon community, found on devseccon.com, where you can find incredible dev and security resources and discuss them with other smart and kind community members. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down, fixing vulnerabilities in code, open source containers, and infrastructure as code. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning back in. I'm Guy Pujarni, and I'm here today with a really exciting guest that I've known for many, many years and have gone in and out of AppSec. We're going to explore all that and now have the benefit of working with more closely at Snyk, and that's Danny Allan, who is Snyk's new Chief Technology Officer, or CTO. Danny, thanks for coming onto the show.
Hey, I'm super excited to be here. Like you say, I think it's been 20 years since we first met, Gaipo, but I'm glad to be back with you again.
Indeed. I don't know. Sometimes it's like makes you really feel old when you start talking in decades. You know, it's like, this thing happened a decade ago. Was it 2 decades ago or 1 decade ago? It's like, oh, okay, now I'm feeling old. So Danny, we're going to dig a lot into sort of, experience and coming in and out of AppSec and all that. But before that, maybe just kind of give us a bit of a primer about, I guess, what you do today and a bit of the journey that got you to it.
Sure. So I've joined Snyk, as you know, as the Chief Technology Officer, and I'm super excited about coming to the space. So if we back up and kind of take the career progression, if you want to call it that, I started back career in the 90s. I was going to university, and my friend bet me that I couldn't break into the university systems. And this was the 90s. It was before you were allowed to do those types of things, or they cared about doing those types of things, maybe. And so I did that.
Catch you as well when you do it. It's like at the time, not really that much attention was being paid.
Yeah. And so they had it was a Honeywell CP6 mainframe on a Banyan Vines network. But anyway, it was fun. I found some vulnerabilities. I found an issue that you could break into the system. And I went to the university and told them that they had this problem, and they hired me. That was actually my first job, was working for the university I was going to. And that was a lot of fun. I did network security, mostly network security, some identity and access management security for the first few years, and went from there to a small startup that you probably know called Watchfire. And at the time they were doing, this was around the dot-com boom. So I was moving from the public sector to the private sector, and they were doing quality analysis, mostly of websites, scanning for broken links and things. And over the course of 7 years with them, that company pivoted from being primarily a quality company to a AppSec company. They acquired a company over in Israel called Sanctum. They had a product called AppScan. And so they went from quality to privacy to security. And I became very, very entrenched and worked a lot with dynamic application security testing. That company ended up being bought by IBM, where we purchased a static application security testing tool. So I got some exposure to that. And really, the interesting thing at IBM, so I ran the security research team there, and it was a very broad portfolio because they did DAST, dynamic application security testing. They did static application security testing. But more than that, they did network security, IDS, IPS. They had web servers, they had all the Tivoli governance things, and it gave me a good understanding of the breadth of the security space.
Yeah, it's worth noting that at the time, the IBM security division didn't exist yet. And so all these things were sort of scattered all over the place, within whatever rational, Tivoli, WebSphere, ISS, et cetera, et cetera.
It was always one of my frustrations there, Gaipo, because we would go into a customer and we had the breadth of all these solutions, but there was no single security division. And so our biggest enemy at the time was ourselves. The salespeople would be competing with one another. And I made the argument, if we combine these things together, we'll have a solution that is unparalleled in the industry. But it was an exciting time, and I don't regret it for a moment. It was fantastic. I learned a lot about large organizations, how they operate, and the breadth of the security field.
Yeah, no, definitely. There was a lot to do there. It just sort of meant a lot more wrangling internally.
Yes.
Those But sorry, I cut you off. So just sort of going through those journeys, which I shared, because I guess maybe kind of worth noting for folks, like Danny and I were co-conspirators on some of that journey. I came over from Sanctum into Watchfire. We get to work together a little bit in some of the Ottawa and Boston locations, and we go a fair bit back. And so some of those learnings were happening together or in parallel, I guess, as we were enjoying and battling the IBM machine.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So then I was at IBM for 3 years, and one of the things that was very evident from the breadth of security is that people often were the cause of security breaches and issues. And I had this idea that, hey, if we can control what people actually do, then we have a better opportunity to control the vulnerable outcomes that occur. And so there was this startup in the Boston area called Dustone, and what they built was a platform that you would have virtualized desktops running in the cloud. Now, that's interesting, but the primary interest for me actually was that if you have consolidated, aggregated desktops all in one place in the cloud, then you have the ability to apply controls to them so you could monitor and manage users and kind of prevent them from making poor mistakes on their own. And so this company was my first foray really into the cloud. My experience with the cloud prior to that was mostly around virtualization and doing security testing in the cloud, but this was building a platform for the cloud, and it was very exciting. Our go-to-market initially was to go to market through cloud providers running this. Over time, we became a provider ourselves, which gave me a huge amount of experience in the operations side of running cloud-hosted services.
Keeping things secure. Not just sort of finding the gaps.
Well, it's interesting. I remember many phone calls that went to 1, 2, 3 in the morning. When things go down, you're just on the phone until issues resolve.
Indeed, a good sobering moment.
Yeah. So I was CTO of Dustone for 3 years, and we were ultimately purchased by VMware. So I had a period of time at VMware. That was a lot of fun. VMware is obviously the dominant player in the virtualization space. At the time, we supported all the hypervisors, but that very narrowly focused us in the VMware ecosystem, and had a lot of really useful and valuable experiences there in understanding virtualized networking with the Nicira acquisition, which became NSX, and virtualized storage and compute, and had a lot of fun there. But at heart, I like to go and build things rather than being a cog in a larger wheel. And so went from Dustone to VMware, but then on to a company called Veeam, which was a data protection company. It was interesting at the time, ransomware was beginning to explode, and the threats were beginning to increase against organizations. And of course, I should say not of course, but at the time, Veeam did backup of the virtualized environment, VMware specifically. And so I joined VMware 7 years ago, and I was there for 7 years. And over those 7 years, we grew from not only protecting VMware environments to all of the hypervisors and all of the physical systems and all of the clouds and all of the SaaS services. In fact, when I was there, we launched 12 new products, and we tripled the company in size of revenue. We were over 5,000 employees, and it was really, really fantastic growth. It was exciting to be there. But at the end of the day, I was attracted back to the application security space. And here I am, back at Snyk.
Get you back into it. And that Veeam, that sort of last sort of section on it, going from VMware to Veeam, I guess got you into data. So I think I'm really kind of curious to pick your brain on, indeed, the learnings from Veeam. They're sort of clearly the most recent on it, and data security, also about the sort of network versus app security, like network security versus app security versus data security, which are interesting to kind of compare and contrast, I guess, and learning between them. But before I do that, I think you have this sort of interesting perspective, which, I don't know, I guess some people would get when they move around, but it's relatively rare, which is you've been in the AppSec space for considerable amount of time and saw it and learned it, and then went to do other security stuff, as you've described. Well, I guess not just security, but security impactful infrastructure changes. And then now you're coming back into AppSec, as we pulled you into Snyk. I mean, for me, I went from AppSec to the world of DevOps, and that gave me maybe a perspective that I think I wouldn't have had if I had stayed in AppSec, around some goodness in DevOps that we can bring into the world of AppSec. I'm curious, coming back into AppSec now, what do you see? Maybe we start from changes. what feels the same and what feels different between whatever the scary period of time ago that was, like whatever it is, 15 years ago, call it, and now?
Well, what would be the same, I guess, I was surprised by some of the things that didn't change. Like dynamic application security testing really hasn't changed. And I made the argument back 15 years ago that static application security testing was better because it enabled you to move earlier in the cycle and fix things faster. And so that hasn't changed a lot. But actually, one of the things that is interesting to me is the techniques used for static application security testing have changed dramatically. I remember the complexity of setting that up and kind of the headaches associated with wiring into that last check before, when you did your builds. And that has become far faster, far better, far easier. And so that was exciting to see. One of the things that surprised me, I expected there to be more correlation. It used to be 15 years ago, you had all these different silos. You would do your software composition analysis, you do your dynamic application security testing, you do your static application security testing. They're all kind of silos of activities. I would have expected them to have been more correlated or merged. And so kind of one of the surprises was that they hadn't been merged to the extent that I would have thought they would. But so many things are the same, many things are different is what I'm finding.
But it's interesting, like the comment on DAST staying the same is interesting because I think I agree that it's DAST as a practice has not changed dramatically. I'm sure there are people that would contest that. I think technologically it has evolved. Like now it includes a bunch of things like doing that dynamic testing via APIs. It includes things like whatever better handling of like single page applications or whatever the word of the day is for these JavaScript based sort of dynamic pages. And so some elements, but fundamentally, I think a lot of it is about the same. But I think almost like the glory days have shifted. When we started static analysis, if you had to pick one, you would do DAST over SAST. And I think today you would do SAST over DAST. Like I think maybe because of that ease that you mentioned, maybe the practicality of being able to run SAST, it kind of has won, I guess, over the complexity of DAST. Does that sound right when you have these kind of fresher conversations with security leads?
Yes, 100%. They would start with the SAST over the DAST. And one of the changes as well I would add to that is back 15 years ago, it was less software composition analysis because a lot of people were writing kind of full stack code from top to bottom. They weren't using open source components in the same way that they are today. Now, in the security leads that I talk to, not only are they starting with SAST, but often starting with the SCA side of it because, of course, application composition has changed over time. I wrote an application, a web-based application back in, 2002 or so. And I wrote the whole thing top to bottom. I didn't use any open source components. And of course, now you would never do that. You would go and assemble that as you're bringing it to market.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense. I guess maybe I feel like there's sort of two things to sort of note there. One is, of course, the sort of the adaptation to technology change. At the end of the day, we're securing what is being built. So if what is being built or how it's being built is different, then security industry has to adapt. But the second is, I do think is a security industry specific, I guess, sort of view or sort of change on it of, I don't know, I feel like that has always evolved from the manual practice, right? Like I feel like when we were doing app scan back then, it was the automation of the manual pen tester action. And so it didn't start from a tech tool. It started from a manual action of someone, bothering to put in 1,000 different, well, if it's human, not 1,000, but 50 odd values into a text box and surely that can be automated and evolving it into sort of DAST. Well, I think SAST came more with sort of automation in mind right away. I guess there was probably a practice of code review, but I think people didn't think about it as a scalable practice maybe to begin with. So I don't know if that makes sense, and I'm kind of butting in a little bit to the journey, but it's interesting to sort of think about the changes that are because of external circumstance versus the changes to the AppSec industry that has been internal. The correlation comment that you make is also interesting. Like why, if you were to sort of guess, right, sort of coming into it, like, what do you hear about like why aren't we, clearly we still need to correlate. Clearly nobody likes duplicates on it. Prioritization is clearly, as vivid a pain as ever. Do you have a sense of like why correlation isn't maybe at the place you would have expected it when you left?
Well, I think it's simply because it's so hard to do. You're coming at it from two different ways, and it's hard to connect those. You're seeing it from the back of the picture to the front of the picture. I mean, if you're looking at a painting or a mural of things, it looks very different from the front than the back, and connecting those two things together is very difficult. Now, I think we're about to change that, quite honestly. I think using artificial intelligence and some of the techniques that are available to us now that were never available to us in the past will change that. But you think about something really simple like an input to an application. If you're doing that from Dast, you're seeing a cookie or a form field or a query string or whatever it happens to be, a header of an HTTP request, and then comparing that to the actual code and the many, many different ways that you can write that construct in a code. It's hard to connect those two dots, certainly by name, but even that, I mean, applications are assembled in real time. So it's a hard problem to solve, and I don't blame the industry for not solving it. I just think they've operated in these silos, and we now have an opportunity to bring the two together. And ultimately, it's not just about bringing the two together. It's actually about making the organization more efficient. You don't want to report two findings. That slows things down. And by making them more efficient, you can prioritize the things that you know are an issue as opposed to the things that you think might be an issue. So it makes you more efficient. It enables you to go faster, but gives you more definitive view of the security of what you're building.
Yeah. We talk a little bit about sort of, changes that expected or unexpected. What surprised you for the better? Sort of coming into it, looking now, a bunch of things are the same maybe, or sort of, kind of the same ladies, the same sort of, group of people or practices, just maybe different percentages. I guess you did note SCA to be a brand new practice, but what has been most impressive? What has been most positively surprising or, positively inclined insight that you're now sort of seeing?
Well, two things I would say. One is that it's moved far earlier in the process. We did SAST in the past, for example. However, it tended to be at the end of the cycle when you were building software. And now we're doing it within PR checks, and we're doing it much, much earlier in the cycle. We're doing it in the IDE with developers. And I think that is a very exciting, positive change because, of course, the earlier you do it, the more proactive you can be, the faster it is, the better it is. And secondly, I would say the speed at which that analysis is done. I remember doing string analysis and these long trees of tracing things from source to sink, and it would take forever. When we did analysis of applications, way back, it would take not just hours, but sometimes days in those big applications to do the analysis. And now the way that we're doing translation of software into graphs and trees and very quickly doing the analysis, it becomes actually practical to do it as part of the cycle as opposed to slowing things down. So both the speed and the timing at which the analysis is doing has impressed me. And then the other thing is, I think just the realization, I guess, of the market, of the benefit of being dev first, doing this earlier in the cycle. Before, that was always a battle. You were battling people, hey, you want to do it earlier and earlier. Now, I believe that's just the accepted norm of the market that, hey, we should be doing this as early as possible in the cycle.
Yeah, I guess I can relate clearly. I'm sort of, part of that sort of conviction path on it's been very evident even over the course of sort of Snyk's existence. Maybe we can helped kind of contribute our nudge to that change. Thanks for the findings. Again, it's just it's an opportunity. It's one of these kind of fresh perspectives, of coming back and sort of seeing, what has changed, what isn't the same when you walk into the house. So I'm curious, the other aspect I'd love to tap your brain from the journey is just sort of the distinction between these domains, having moved, sometimes you see a lot of people that move from, I don't know which one is the dark side, but from the practitioner to the vendor. I guess the vendor is the dark side. Yeah, the vendor is the dark side to the sort of the practitioner. You've sort of had a chance to be on the vendor side, but dealing with network security, dealing with data security, with application security. I guess any intersections between them or sort of learnings that you think are worth noting between these different domains, areas in which, we can learn from one practice, something we should bring into the other?
Well, the different domains are very much interconnected. You hear a lot today about DSPM, Data Security Posture Management, and CSPM, Cloud Security Posture Management, and ASPM, Application Security Posture Management. And I think of them as distinct things, actually. I'm coming from a company, from Veeam, 7 years there, that was very much data-centric. And so you're looking at production data and protecting that and understanding how it was deployed and how it was configured. And then if you look at CSPM, I know that the C stands for cloud, but I think a lot of that around the configuration of the operations as opposed to the data itself. At Veeam, we're protecting the data, but then you look at the CSPM organizations and it's about the configuration, then application security posture management being about how things are built. I do see, I won't say a collision course, but very much a complementary connection between these different elements. And I think the organizations that will win and the value that will be added is, how do you take these things, put them together in a way that actually gives clarity to the organization in prioritizing and making sure that they end up at the end of the day in delivering more secure services. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
I think it's a really good observation on it. And it's interesting to equate it to what's happening in sort of the DevOps land, because I think a lot of times these same lines used to be much more blurred in terms of who handles them. It used to be that you had someone dealing with the configuration, what you'd kind of open a ticket, and the specialized team would set up a system and configure it. And you'd want data, you'd open a ticket, and a different team, will deal with that data. And today, they're all kind of an API call away or a cloud config away. And oftentimes the same individual, a developer of some sort, maybe varying between an app developer and a platform developer, that would vary. So it's interesting. It's a good observation, I think, to say that as that is happening, the security industry's response to that would be to evolve these security posture management and then preceded by fill in the blank to doing it. But in practice, they might overlap. I'm curious though, as you look even within these SPMs, there's some things that I think that I can sort of think of as we learn from one to the other, but do you see learnings from, XSPM, whatever it is, CSPM moving into DSPM, moving into ASPM or vice versa on it? I guess, how do you see the flow of practices, or are they sufficiently distinct domains that you actually don't think you think the practices should be quite different?
I think the practices will end up being different, will continue to be different for the time being. It's my own kind of personal opinion. I do think there's a collision course between DSPM and CSPM, the data and the configuration. They tend to be more operational and more in the runtime or the DevOps. And I know everyone says, hey, developers are going to take over the operating things. And I know there's different opinions on this, but the way I think about it is developers typically like to build. They prefer not to have to run. Now, sometimes they're pushed into it, and in some organizations they do. They not only build, but they run. But I expect the running of things to be the ones where the merging happens first, and probably the building of things separate. But having them very much complementary, in my mind, is important. You're going to want to have the collaboration between the different domains, and maybe eventually they will come together, but probably not in the time frame that anyone here thinks. It might be 2 years, it might be 10 years. I use the analogy sometimes. I go into a grocery store, I want to pick up the groceries. I don't want to bag the groceries. Developers want to build things. They don't necessarily want to operate things. And so I do expect to see the separation. I just think we need more collaboration, more partnership, more interaction between the teams. And that's really what the industry is moving towards now.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I guess I sometimes think of it as like centers of gravity. It's like, there are some things in which the source of truth, what everything revolves around, is like what's happening to the systems. They're running, they're being operated, what's going on. And so for that, you come along and that maybe brings you into sort of seeing DevOps and SecOps being closer to one another than necessarily SecOps and AppSec. It's almost like, which part of that word do you want to connect? And similarly with data, you see a question as well. The center of gravity clearly is the data. And so is cloud the right scope for it? Or should it be, because data flows between these different entities? And so as long as the centers of gravity would be different, which I think is sort of similar to, you're sort of saying something similar from a human perspective of like people's preferences or where their attention is, which creates those different centers of gravity.
Yeah, the data comment is interesting because when I came to Veeam, I always thought of data as databases. In my mind, it was all structured databases. And I came to realize that data can mean anything that the organization wants it to be. Certainly structured data and unstructured data was part of it, but applications were part of that. Networks were actually part of that. And so I do think there's an evolution of who is managing those different areas within the organization, and they just become centers of gravity. You have what used to be DBAs that tend to gravitate towards data classification and asset management and those kinds of things. You have your IT teams that gravitated towards the configuration and running and operational side of things. You have your developers, obviously, that are continuing to develop, but doing more of the other items as well. So I don't know. It's a great time to be alive. It's interesting to see the evolution of the industry.
So let's talk a little bit about data security, and sort of dig into that. So I wanted to pick your brain as someone who's lived it, the last sort of 7 years. I guess, what are the key tenets right now? What do you, when you think about like the most important things when it comes to data security? And maybe if there's a perspective of like in your 7 years, I'm sure data has clearly become a more and more important kind of aspect of the ecosystem. Has that center changed? Were there sort of new security attention areas over those 7 years that you feel have gone from marginal to central?
Two things I would say happened in the data space over the 7 years. One was at the beginning, ransomware wasn't nearly as big of an issue. And what happened over the 7 years is ransomware came to the forefront of probably the most significant threat that organizations were facing. I mean, I know we talk about advanced persistent threats and vulnerabilities and CVEs and all of that, but in the organizations that I talked to, the ransomware threat was by far the most prevalent. The statistics were off the charts. Almost every single organization I've ever talked to has had at least one attack. And so that resulted in some fundamental changes in the way data was managed. And probably primary in that was the immutability of the data. So when you have your systems, whether it be code bases, your application services, or your databases, structured and unstructured data, or your network configurations, or your services. Number one was to take a copy of that and put it in an immutable location. And even the concept of immutability changed over time, because initially immutability was on premises, but the ransomware would actually get smarter with that. It would go and look for the storage systems. It would take root access and it would try to delete the so-called immutable systems. And so immutability changed from being something that was on premises to something that was up in the cloud outside of your control. So even if you were an administrator, you couldn't go and delete something that was in the cloud. And actually, by the end of my time at Veeam, we were sending 2 exabytes of data into the cloud on a yearly basis. It was a massive amount. And a big reason for that was protect the data, make sure that it can't be destroyed or altered or changed. The other thing that changed, I would say, over the period of the 7 years was the controls along with that. It used to be the administrator had full access for everything. And over time, you saw a lot more multi-person authentication. You didn't want to give anyone the control to do any single action. Mm-hmm. And so you saw a lot of multi-person authentication or four eyes authentication, depends what you call it, for all of the sensitive actions, not just deletion or changing of policy, but a lot more governance in the protection of that data over time.
That last point is a really interesting one when you think about AppSec. I mean, would you anticipate that the same thing happens? Like, I guess authorization oftentimes, I know identity is probably its own domain next to it, but authorization is something that in AppSec and sort of configuration very much kind of close to those worlds. I guess on the login side, we've seen, two-factor authentication or sort of improvements like that have gone further up. Do you think, has the practice of that sort of multi-person, multi-stakeholder authorization, is it becoming easy enough that you can see it spread into assets that are maybe not quite as dramatically central as your database and becoming a broader practice?
Yes, I think there is opportunity there. If you think about, a vulnerability that's found within an organization, developer may not want to fix it and they say ignore it. Do you really want the developer to take a critical issue and hit the ignore button? Maybe your policy changes so that you need 2 people to agree. Maybe the developer agrees with a security person. And so I think that practice of having controls spread out more broadly becomes important. And maybe even the decision of what those things are gets handed off to an ML type system that says, hey, these things are of such severity that I'm not going to allow it, and these things are of less severity, and an individual can make a decision on them. But I do expect to see that concept of 2 people turning the key to allow an action to become more prevalent in many different disciplines, including application security.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about equating that to code review, because to an extent, that's actually what we're describing over here is actually totally the standard practice for checking in code. It's like you're checking in code. By all means, you can be amazing. Someone should look at it before you do it anyway. And that's a typical high-quality team kind of best practice. Why isn't that being done for security issues? So maybe an opportunity for some change. There's a lot, each of these things is its own kind of rabbit hole that we can go down on it. I know that you've been thinking a lot about AI and, you've already referenced it, I think 5 times, as potential solutions, you can use ML for this, you can do AI. And I think it's because, truthfully, it's it's impactful in various ways. Maybe, fine, you have all that sort of, we talked a lot about the past. We talked about a lot of what changed and maybe sort of getting into the present. I know today at Snyk, you're spending a lot of time on AI and on where it can lead us. Because what are your thoughts? What are the top exciting kind of paths that you think it would unlock like feel free if you want to sort of dig further into stuff that you've already mentioned or sort of new ones.
Well, the great thing is that Snyk's already using AI in a number of areas that I think is super valuable. Like just vulnerability identification is something that the Deep Code engine is using AI on, and I think continuing to iterate on that. But if I look at kind of new and emerging areas that are interesting, one would be around asset classification. There's a whole category. DSPM actually, as a category, is mostly just about looking at all the data, classifying it, and making sure that the right people have the right information and doing all the identification and classification and prioritization based on that data. I think there's an opportunity to do something similar using ML techniques in the application space. In a standard organization, they probably have thousands of repos and tens of thousands of different components within those repos. And it's a fairly manual and difficult task to figure out what all those things are. So imagine a world where you have some classification system that goes and identifies everything within the organization, classifies it for you, filters it, prioritizes it, assigns it. There's just a lot of opportunity just in the classification space using large language models to help the organization be smarter about what they have. Another area that I think is super interesting is around threat modeling. Threat modeling's been around forever. If you could see my bookshelf behind me here, I have a book on threat modeling from 20 years ago. But very few organizations do that because it tends to slow down development. It's hard to do. It tends to be the security practice, not the development practice. And I think, well, using the modern techniques of static application security testing, we can understand the data flows in ways that we could never do in the past. And could we automate using ML threat modeling for organizations? Maybe we can't bring it 100% of the way there, but maybe we can bring it 95% of the way there and then have developers iterate on the models that have been created for them. Not only does that help the organization do more comprehensive threat modeling, but it actually helps inform and prioritize the actions that they're going to do based on what they have within the organization itself. Another one is just a human element. People are people, and something that interests you may not interest me. So if you and I got the same results of vulnerabilities that we should be addressing, I would be interested outside of you and I, like knowing Gaipo is interested in fixing, I don't know, SQL injection vulnerabilities, and Danny's drawn more towards buffer overflows and he's in unmanaged languages. I think there's actually opportunity to use AI to understand human behavior, which then drives learning and education and certification and focus points within the organization at a human level. So, I mean, there's a dozen different things I could think of, but I think AI and machine learning, and I'm being careful in my use of those words, can be used in many different areas. The generative AI specifically, Snyk is already doing this, AI fixes, like generate the fixes for the developers or generate the rules that we use to test for vulnerabilities. Right now, that tends to be a manual effort. If you look back in the AppScan days, and I'm sure even at Snyk, you have really smart security developers or security researchers that are creating the rules. Could you have an AI engine actually iterate on those rules? Because a rule that works for one person might not work for another person. And so it's going to dramatically change this industry in ways that I think you and I can only begin to imagine at the moment. And it's why I'm so excited actually to come back to the AppSec space.
Yeah, I think all of those are spot on, and you're right, you can probably sort of spell out a dozen more pretty easily. I like, just in light of the conversation we just had, it's interesting to think about threat modeling and just sort of harken back a little bit to the doubters that we've sort of seen about static analysis 15, 20 years ago, where people basically thought static analysis cannot happen or cannot succeed because scanning code is an NP-complete problem, you can never do it perfectly, and it's almost the sort of assumption that because you can't do it perfectly today, you can't do it later, or that it has to be done perfectly to be valuable. Fast forward to today, static code analysis is sort of alive and well, and it's far from perfect, but it is valuable enough that everybody is using it and embracing it in various ways. Today, you look at the code, it's like, yeah, but can you really, like the words, sort of the threat model, can you really do that? And I was like, well, actually, maybe we sit here in 10 years and talk about the same type of transition of the beginning. It's clunky, it took a while, it was not terribly kind of valuable, but as we sort of built it up and as we learned it, can we get it to a place that it's automated? But your point about the human changes is really interesting. Sort of the picture that comes to mind is it's almost like the Spotify DJ, sort of pick the music I want to hear right now. Can you kind of almost pick the vulnerabilities that I should be told about in ways that are more than just, the ones that kind of need to be fixed, but also the ones that would trigger my curiosity that I would be best equipped to handle, etc., which I think is really a really interesting and slightly mind-bending kind of path for security people to think. Cool. Well, Danny, I think there's a ton more that we can dig into over here. I think we're sort of running out of time. I guess the good news for sort of listeners is you're going to get more opportunities to get Danny's insights and inputs. So more on that in the episodes that are coming. And Danny, before I kind of let you head out, I as you know, I like to kind of ask sort of an open-ended question at the end. And we just talked about AI. So I think I'll sort of stick to my question from past recent episodes, which is, if you could automate away any part of your job to AI, if you can delegate that to AI, what job would that be?
It would, without a question, be the administration of my day-to-day calendar and email. One of the things that is interesting in coming over to Snyk is everything goes through Slack. And it's hard to know sometimes what is the ephemeral discussions versus the important discussions versus the things that need to result in a calendar invite. If I could have an AI engine that would help me with the administrative side of my life, that would be by far the most valuable thing that I could take from it at the moment.
Yeah. And it's amazing how this question has kind of been leading people to a variety of levels, whether it's Slack or the calendar or the email, whatever it is. We just basically want to sort of focus on the substance, which is interesting. And I guess I wonder, as humans, I feel the same. If you sort of ask me the question, that's probably my natural tendency as well. I'm just sort of curious about how much of that we're used to. That's the pain we see, and we still don't see the potential. We don't, we still think about the internet of old, and how would we find a thing maybe, or sort of find some piece of information? Think of it as it's a very big encyclopedia that we can get information, and we don't envision whatever the e-commerce and sort of ride sharing and other comparisons to it. I guess we'll live and see. Danny, thanks for coming onto the show, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thank you for listening to The Secure Developer. You will find other episodes and full transcripts on devseccon.com. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and don't forget to leave us a review on Apple iTunes or Spotify, and share the episode with others who may enjoy it and gain value from it. If you would like to recommend a guest or topic or share some feedback, you can find us on Twitter at DevSecCon and LinkedIn at The Secure Developer. See you in the next episode.